Well, we're beginning our show with a very special interview. Joining us now in the studio is the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. Prime Minister Olmert served as the leader of Israel from 2006 to 2009, after also serving as the mayor of Jerusalem for nearly a decade. The Israeli leader led the country through war, peace efforts, and even scandal, and today we're going to discuss the implications of his leadership, along with the esteemed author, jurist, and lawyer, Professor Alan Dershowitz. This will be Prime Minister Olmert's first English language interview since this story broke. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, well, what we would like to do is begin with talking about the nuclear threat from Syria. Can you take us back to what went on in your head the first day you heard about the nuclear threat from Syria, and take us inside those talks with America, with President Bush and Condoleezza Rice at the time?
Well, this is, of course, a story that took a few months to discuss, to analyze, to decide which course of action should be taken and to actually execute it. So it's, as we say, it's a long story. But I can say that naturally when I first heard about the atomic reactor, I know it will change the priorities of my position as Prime Minister of Israel for a period of time until everything will be resolved. This was a major threat. Perhaps the real greatest threat that Israel faced, maybe since its creation. It's true that the Iranian threat of nuclear weapons is something that we should take very seriously. We take it very seriously, but Iran is way behind a possession of a real capacity. While here there was a nuclear plutonic reactor that was almost at the last phase of its building. And once it would have warmed up, it was unlikely that we could destroy it because the terrible pollution, particularly near the river Euphrates, could have created a terrible, terrible outcome to the lives of millions of people, and this is something that we may have not been able to do. So once we realized that there is an atomic reactor and that this reactor is quite close to completion, we shared the information with the President of America, at that time George W. Bush. I made a special trip to America. Of course, we didn't conceal any of the facts, and no one knew about it except for the heads of the CIA and the National Security Advisor and the President himself and the Vice President. We discussed the possible option of America destroying the atomic reactor. The reason I talked to the President about this was not because I thought that Israel couldn't do it. There was no question in my mind that if Israel will have to, of course, we will destroy the atomic reactor. But I thought that since Israel said that the ultimate responsibility for the prevention of any atomic capabilities by Iran is the primary responsibility of America and the big powers, right. I thought that it could be a very important signal to Iran had America destroyed the atomic reactor in Syria on the same basis that America says we will not allow any irresponsible leadership any place in the world to possess weapons that could create mass destruction.
And you know, it's interesting. Obviously, Alan, I'd like to kind of hear your take on what was happening at the time, because obviously you were viewing this from a very different perspective.
Well, first of all, I want the public to understand what a brilliant decision it was by Prime Minister Olmert to do what he did. Number one, to try to get the United States to do it. He explained why that would be very important. But second, to tell the President of the United States, with whom he had a wonderful relationship, that he was going to make that decision. And if he didn't have that kind of wonderful relationship, a uniquely good relationship with the President of the United States, the President may have reacted very differently from the way he reacted. Then executing the plan and being able to destroy it with minimal damage, collateral, and finally to do it in a way that didn't permit the Syrians to respond and didn't require them to take action, because I know the Israeli Defense Forces were prepared for a counteraction by the Syrians or by Hezbollah. And I think it sends the Israelis lots of messages. Number one, Israel always has to prepare to do on its own what it has to do to defend itself. In relation to Iran, that's clearly the case. As Elie Wiesel once said, always believe the threats of your enemies more than the promises of your friends. So always have enough self-determination to make the decision. Do it wisely. Do it in a way that minimizes possible responses. And imagine what the world would be like today if Assad had nuclear weapons. By the way, that area that was bombed was subsequently captured by ISIS. Mm-hmm. So Olmert deserves the Nobel Peace Prize for his act of war.
All right. Well, I now have a question for both of you. We're looking at Hezbollah and Iran all over Israel's northern doorstep. Just yesterday on our show, Major General Amos Yadlin, who was head of intelligence at the time, said the example of Israel's bombing of this reactor reestablished Israel's deterrence power in the Arab world after the Lebanon war. Now, we have the Iran nuclear deal in the balance and, of course, North Korea. What can we learn from those lessons, and how can we apply them right now?
The lesson is that Israel has to send a message, hopefully with the support of the United States, that it will hold Iran to the statement it made in the deal in the prologue. Iran reaffirms that it will never, under any circumstances, seek to develop or acquire nuclear weapons. The United States should make it absolutely clear that they regard that as a binding obligation and will authorize the President of the United States to take whatever action is necessary to prevent Iran from breaking that pledge, breaking that promise. Having said that, Israel has to make it very clear to the world that it is prepared to act on its own, if necessary, as a last resort, to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear arsenal, because a nuclear-armed Iran would be so much more dangerous than a nuclear-armed Korea. Korea doesn't have hegemonic interests in the region. It just wants to preserve its own regime, whereas Iran is the greatest exporter of terrorism. It has been responsible for so many terrorist acts, and its leaders have said they would not hesitate to sacrifice millions of Iranians in order to end the nation state of the Jewish people.
All right, well, I'd like to turn now to our next topic. The current Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is, of course, embroiled in a number of corruption scandals at the moment. Now, you were quoted on Israeli TV as advising him to step down amidst these investigations. Why did you recommend that?
What I just should suggest to him, in principle, is this. Whatever you do it in an elegant and dignified manner so that the position of the prime ministership of the State of Israel will not be compromised.
Well, I just fundamentally disagree with that. I do think that this effort to criminalize political differences has to come to a stop. And if you don't like what you think Prime Minister Netanyahu did, then vote against him in the next election. But putting forth 4 or 5 what I regard as trivial, non-criminal allegations, hoping that because all of them together look like there's smoke, is a serious mistake. Sometimes smoke is a result of arson, not natural fires. So I hope that the Prime Minister fights these charges and ends this attempt to criminalize political differences. I said the same thing about you, Mr. Prime Minister. I've said the same thing when Rabin was forced to leave office because of his wife's bank account, when Sharon was being investigated. I just don't like the criminalization of political differences, whether it's in the United States or in Israel. So I hope the Prime Minister continues to fight these charges and remains the Prime Minister. And I think that helps dignify the office rather than leaving under a cloud of unwarranted suspicion.
Well, you were perhaps the Israeli Prime Minister that was closest to reaching a peace deal with the Palestinians back in 2008. That's because you granted perhaps the most generous concessions in any such offer ever made, from offering a near total withdrawal from the West Bank, proposing that Israel retain 6.3% of the territory in order to keep control of Jewish settlements. Those are just some examples of what that deal was. Why were you willing to grant so many concessions, and why didn't the deal work out?
Well, I was ready to grant concessions because I thought that if you want to make peace, you need to make compromises. You need to make concessions. I think that the the present situation, which has already exists for 50 years, that Israel controls the life of millions of Palestinians without granting them full and equal civil rights and human rights under the occupation of Israel, is something that will destroy the fabric, the basic fabric, the moral fabric of the State of Israel. This is not something that we want to perpetuate. We need to stop it. Unlike others, I truly and genuinely and fundamentally believe that every single inch of land from the Jordan River to the sea is a Jewish land. So when I talk about concessions, I don't talk about concessions of a land which is not part of us. That's not a concession.
Well, and it wasn't easy what you did. A concession is only
when you are prepared to concede something which you fundamentally believe to be yours, but for the sake of achieving a much greater goal, you are ready to compromise. Now, so that's what I propose, and I think Alan agrees with me in principle. Now the question is how much, and what I basically agreed is that the basis will be the borders of 67 with swaps. Yeah. So if we retain 6% of the territory, we'll have to give them 6% equal size territory on the other side. Now, we were very close. Abu Mazen, Dr. Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, said that had I remained prime minister for a few more months, we most likely would have agreed and signed peace, and there will be peace now for years between Israel and the Palestinians. He kept saying it time and again, time and again,
Well, you also told him that if he weren't to accept this deal,
yes, I thought he was scared. There were many reasons, partly because some of my political rivals or competitors or challengers went to him as they went to Condi Rice, and she writes it in her book. I can even give you the number of the page, I think 741, but you check it, in which she says that, you know, senior ministers in my cabinet, at the time when I was in a very shaky political situation, they came to her and said, don't cherish Olmert's proposals, he has no support for it and he lost his political power and so on and so forth. And they also went to Abu Mazen, to Mahmoud Abbas. So it was a very delicate and unstable political situation, and also because the Palestinians, unfortunately, didn't have the courage to accept my proposals.
Right, they rejected it ultimately.
They never say that they reject it. Well, they just never say that they accept it. Okay. And so I have an entirely different approach from the present government about the peace process, and I don't want to repeat my position. I think it's well known. But I never said, never did I say, never will I say that the fact that we don't have peace is because it's the failure of Israel. It's the reason is the lack of courage and determination by the Palestinians.
What I will say is that, I mean, you've said that one of the reasons for the allegations leveled against you was that you were getting too close to getting peace with the Palestinians. Do you still believe that?
There were some, certainly there were some that were trying to use every possible power in order to stop me, including to try and incriminate me, that's for sure, in order to stop me. They thought that this is a crime against the Jewish history and the Jewish people to evacuate from territories which are the Saka Jewish territories, and who does it deserves to be punished. And
the Sunni Arabs today would accept a situation where Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, West Jerusalem is the location of the American embassy, and there's a capital for the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. They can have a borough within the united city of Jerusalem. There are so many different ways of resolving this that we ought to be sitting down at the negotiating table and have the Israelis and the Palestinians resolve it. But the Palestinians, as Avi Ibn once said, have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. The Palestinians simply have to sit down and be willing to make the same kinds of painful compromises that you are prepared to make for Israel.
But, Alan, I wish that I could say that the Prime Minister or the government of Israel today approves of my peace plan as a basis for negotiations. And so if on that basis the Palestinians will still decline to come to sit to the table, that will be a very grave mistake.
All right, well, we've come to almost the end of our interview here, and it's perhaps the biggest question of all. Are you considering going back to politics?
Why is it so important?
I think it's a pretty important
I
question.
would have been much happier had you asked Alan Dershowitz. Don't you think it's time for a formidable character like you, with such an enormous influence worldwide, that has been listened to by people everywhere in the world, to come and make some changes in Israeli politics? Instead, you ask an old-timer like me. It's not on the agenda at the present time. Anyway.
It's not on the agenda at the present time. All right, now make sure to catch ILTV's Ask Alan for the full interview with Professor Alan Dershowitz and former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert.